Can you pretend to be my wife for 1 week? Black man begged the stranger to save his daughter's birthday. The rain fell in cold, relentless sheets, plastering Elena's thin coat to her skin and blurring the neon lights of the city into a cruel watercolor painting. Each drop felt like a tiny judgment, a reminder of every wrong turn that had led her to this moment. Shivering at a bus stop in the dead of night, the last of her dignity washed away with the grime on the pavement. In her arms, her 5-year-old daughter, Lily, slept, her small body a precious, warm weight against Elena's own chilled frame. The eviction notice had felt like a death sentence, and now, with only a handful of crumpled bills and some loose change in her pocket, the finality of it was settling in. She had failed. She had failed her child. A sob caught in her throat, hot and sharp. She blinked back tears, determined not to wake the one person in the world who still believed she was a superhero. The rhythmic swish of tires on wet asphalt was the city's mournful lullaby, until one sound broke the pattern. A low, powerful hum that grew closer, resolving into the sleek form of a black sedan that pulled silently to the curb beside her. The window slid down, and a man's face, etched with a desperation that mirrored her own, looked out at her. "Please, I know this is insane, but I need your help." His voice was a low rumble, strained with an urgency that cut through the sound of the rain. What could a man in a car that cost more than she'd ever earned in her life possibly need from her? Elena clutched Lily tighter, a protective instinct overriding her exhaustion. Men in expensive cars who approached women at bus stops late at night were never the beginning of a fairy tale. They were the beginning of a nightmare. "I don't have any money," she said, her voice flat and hollow. The man, handsome and well-dressed in a tailored suit, shook his head, his eyes wide with a frantic energy. He pushed the car door open and stepped out into the downpour, heedless of the rain soaking his expensive clothes. He was tall and broad-shouldered, a commanding presence, yet his expression was one of complete and utter brokenness. He wasn't looking at her with malice or ill intent. He was looking at her as if she were his last hope on earth. He stopped a few feet away, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "It's not about money. Not your money, anyway. I need something else. Something I can't buy." His gaze flickered from Elena's face to the sleeping child in her arms, and a flicker of understanding, or perhaps profound sadness, crossed his features. He took a deep breath, the words rushing out of him as if he were afraid they'd get stuck if he paused. "Can you pretend to be my wife for 1 week?" The question was so absurd, so utterly disconnected from her reality, that for a moment Elena thought she was hallucinating from cold and hunger. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Mister, I'm just trying to figure out where my daughter and I are going to sleep tonight. I don't have time for games." "This isn't a game," he insisted, his voice cracking. "It's for my daughter. It's her birthday. Please." How could a desperate plea from a wealthy stranger, a man who lived in a world she could barely imagine, possibly change the lives of two souls shivering in the rain? Elena looked from his pleading eyes to her own daughter's peaceful face, and a strange, unwelcome flicker of empathy stirred within her. She knew what it was to be willing to do anything, absolutely anything, for your child. Against all her better judgment, she heard herself ask the one word that would unravel her entire world. "Why?" His name was Julian Vance. He ushered her and a now drowsy Lily out of the rain and into the plush leather interior of his car, the scent of wealth and clean cologne, a stark contrast to the damp misery they'd left behind. He drove them to a small, all-night diner, a bright oasis in the dark city, and insisted on buying them hot chocolate and a warm meal before he would say another word. Lily, wide-eyed at the unexpected treat, sipped her drink happily, oblivious to the strange tension that hung between the two adults. As they sat in the worn vinyl booth, Julian finally began to explain. His daughter, Maya, was turning 6 in a few days. It was a milestone that should have been a joyous occasion, but it was shrouded in grief. It was her first birthday since her mother, Sarah, had passed away a year ago. She hasn't been the same since," Julian said, his gaze fixed on the swirling steam rising from his coffee cup. "She's retreated into herself." into a world where I can't reach her. He confessed that he'd been driving aimlessly for hours, consumed by a suffocating sense of failure as a father, when he saw Elena at the bus stop. "I saw the way you were holding your daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The way you shielded her from the wind, even though you were shivering yourself. There was a gentleness there, a strength. Something my little girl hasn't felt in a very long time." Maya's one and only birthday wish, a wish she hadn't even spoken to him but had whispered to her child therapist during a session, was to have a mommy at her party. Not a new mommy, not a replacement, but just a mommy. A warm, smiling presence to cut the cake and open the presents. "I know it's crazy," he said, finally looking at her directly. His eyes were dark and filled with a pain so profound it made Elena's own troubles feel momentarily distant. "But I would do anything to see her smile again." Even for a day, he reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a checkbook. He wrote a figure on it that made Elena's breath catch in her chest. It was more money than she had ever seen. Enough to get a new apartment, to buy Lily new clothes, to erase all the fear and instability that had become their constant companions. He slid it across the table. "1 week. That's all I'm asking. Be her mother for 1 week, through her birthday party. I'll give you this and more if you need it. Anything." Elena stared at the check, her mind reeling. The number was a lifeline, a magical key that could unlock a future free from fear. She could say yes. She could take the money and play a part for a few days. It was a simple transaction. But as she looked at Julian's face, she didn't see a businessman proposing a deal. She saw a heartbroken father, just as desperate as she was, trying to save his child in the only way he knew how. The thought of taking money for something so raw, so personal, felt deeply wrong, felt like profiting from his pain. Then, sensing her hesitation, Julian delivered the final, devastating piece of the story, the detail that would change everything. "There's more," he said quietly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's not just that she's sad, Elena. Maya. She hasn't spoken a single word since the day her mother died. Not one word in a full year." The diner's cheerful background noise faded into a dull roar. A silent child, a father's desperate hope. This was no longer about a rich man's whim. This was about a little girl trapped in a cage of grief, and a father willing to try any key, no matter how strange, to set her free. The therapist had called it a long shot, a form of play therapy, but believed that creating a temporary, safe, and stable maternal environment, fulfilling this one deep-seated wish, might just be the breakthrough Maya needed to find her voice again. Elena stared at the check on the table, the crisp paper representing a path to an easier life. Then she looked at Julian, at the raw hope and anguish warring in his eyes. She thought of Maya, a little girl she had never met, silenced by a sorrow too big for her small heart to bear. She thought of Lily, sleeping peacefully in the booth beside her, and the fierce, unconditional love she felt for her own child. To rent out that love, to put a price tag on a mother's comfort, felt like a betrayal of the very thing Julian had seen in her at the bus stop. Slowly, deliberately, she slid the check back across the table. Julian's eyes widened in disbelief. "I don't understand." "I won't take your money for this," Elena said, her voice quiet but firm. The decision settled in her soul, solid and right. For the first time all night, she felt a flicker of her old self. The woman she was before desperation had worn her down. "If I do this, it will be for your daughter. It will be because another child is hurting and maybe, just maybe, I can help. It won't be for your wallet." Julian was speechless. He stared at her, a complex mix of shock, confusion, and profound respect dawning on his face. He was a man who moved in a world where everything and everyone had a price. His entire life was a series of transactions, of leveraging assets and negotiating terms. Elena's refusal was an act so far outside his experience that it completely disarmed him. It was the ultimate proof of her integrity, the final confirmation that his wild, desperate instinct at the bus stop had been right. She was different. She was genuine. "But you need it," he stammered, gesturing vaguely toward her worn coat and the sleeping form of Lily. "You and your daughter. You have nowhere to go." "We'll figure it out," Elena said, though the familiar knot of fear tightened in her stomach. "We always do." He shook his head, a new resolve hardening his features. "No, I can't accept your help and let you walk out of here and back onto the street. That's not. I won't do that." He thought for a moment, his CEO mind clicking into gear, finding a new angle, a new framework. "All right, then don't think of it as a payment. Think of it as a job. A temporary contract. You'll be a family consultant. For 1 week. You'll be compensated for your time and expertise with a proper salary, and you and your daughter will be provided with full room and board. It's a professional arrangement." He was reframing it, dressing it up in corporate language to make it palatable, to allow her to accept his help without sacrificing her pride. It was a thoughtful, surprisingly gentle gesture. Elena looked at Lily, who was starting to stir, her small face rosy with warmth and sleep. She thought of the cold, unforgiving streets, of the shelters that were already full, of the terrifying uncertainty that awaited them. Julian was offering her daughter a warm bed, a safe place. For that, she could swallow her pride. For Lily, she could do anything. "Okay," she whispered, the word feeling momentous. "For 1 week. As a consultant." A wave of relief so powerful it was almost visible washed over Julian. "Okay," he breathed, a genuine, grateful smile touching his lips for the first time. "Thank you." The drive to Julian's home was a journey into another dimension. They left the gritty, rain-slicked streets of the city behind and ascended into a world of quiet, tree-lined avenues and stately buildings. The car finally came to a stop before a soaring skyscraper of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the clouds. A private elevator whisked them silently upward, opening directly into Julian's penthouse apartment. The space was breathtaking and impossibly vast. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the glittering city below, a god's-eye view of the world that had felt so hostile to Elena just an hour before. The furniture was sleek and minimalist, the colors a muted palette of grays, creams, and blacks. It was less a home and more a gallery, a stunning but sterile testament to wealth and taste. There were no crayon marks on the walls, no scattered toys, no sense of the chaotic, messy warmth of a family. A profound, echoing silence filled the air. In the center of the enormous living room stood a small girl with large, solemn brown eyes and 2 neat braids. This had to be Maya. She was clutching a worn teddy bear, her expression watchful and unreadable. A severe-looking woman in a crisp uniform, presumably the nanny, stood behind her. "Maya, this is Elena," Julian said, his voice suddenly uncertain. He had concocted this insane plan, but now, faced with his silent daughter, the reality of it seemed to hit him. "And this is her daughter, Lily. They're going to be staying with us for a little while." Maya's gaze shifted to Elena, her eyes taking in every detail with an unnerving intensity. There was no flicker of recognition, no hint of a smile. She just stared, her silence a heavy blanket in the already quiet room. Lily, usually so bubbly, seemed to sense the strange atmosphere and clung to Elena's leg. Elena's heart went out to the little girl. She knew better than to force an interaction. The grief in Maya's eyes was a fortress, and you couldn't storm a fortress. You had to wait for the gate to be opened from the inside. Kneeling down to Lily's level, she smiled gently. "Look, sweetie, there are some crayons and paper on the table over there. Why don't we draw a picture of a big, sunny rainbow to chase all this rain away?" Lily's face lit up. Elena followed her to a low coffee table, sat down on the plush white rug, and began to draw, her movements calm and unhurried. She didn't look at Maya, didn't speak to her. She simply created a small, safe circle of activity, a pocket of normalcy in the strange, grand room. She drew a lopsided house with a curly plume of smoke, and Lily drew a bright yellow sun with squiggly rays. Julian watched from a distance, a silent, tense observer. He saw the nanny leading Maya toward her bedroom, but the little girl resisted, her eyes fixed on Elena and Lily. Slowly, Hesitantly, she pulled her hand free and walked over to the coffee table. She didn't sit, but she stood close, watching as Elena colored in the windows of her drawing. Elena picked up a blue crayon. "I think this house needs some pretty blue curtains," she said softly to Lily. Then, without looking up at Maya, she held the crayon out in her general direction. "Or maybe you think a different color would be better." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a small hand reached out and took the crayon from Elena's fingers. Maya knelt on the other side of the table and, with intense concentration, began to add a small, hesitant patch of blue to the sky above the house. It was a tiny gesture, a silent communication, but in the echoing quiet of that penthouse, it felt as loud as a shout. Julian let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a knot of tension in his chest loosening for the first time in a year. He saw a flicker of warmth, a tiny spark of life, enter the cold, beautiful space he called home. The next few days unfolded in a series of quiet, tentative steps. Elena and Lily moved into a guest suite that was larger and more luxurious than any apartment Elena had ever lived in. The first morning, Elena woke early and, unable to bear the sterile silence of the kitchen, decided to make pancakes. She found the high-end appliances intimidating but managed to whip up a simple batter from scratch. Soon, the scent of melting butter and warm maple syrup filled the air, a homey, comforting aroma that was utterly alien to the penthouse. Julian emerged from his office, drawn by the smell, and stopped in the doorway, a look of stunned surprise on his face. Maya was already there, sitting at the huge marble island, watching Elena with her usual silent intensity. Elena placed a plate with a single, small pancake in front of her. "I made you a smiley face," she said softly, pointing to the chocolate chips she'd used for eyes and a mouth. Maya stared at the pancake for a full minute. Then, she picked up her fork and took a tiny, deliberate bite. These small moments became the building blocks of a fragile new reality. There was the afternoon they all sat on the floor building a lopsided tower of blocks that Lily inevitably knocked over, eliciting a tiny, almost imperceptible smile from Maya. There was the evening Elena found a children's book and sat on the sofa reading it aloud to Lily, only to look up and find Maya curled in the far corner, listening intently. Julian found himself watching them constantly. He saw the way Elena spoke to Maya with a gentle respect, never pushing her, always leaving an open invitation. He saw the way Lily, with her innocent, unfiltered joy, seemed to be a bridge, reaching Maya in a way no adult could. He had hired a consultant, a stranger to play a role, but what he was witnessing felt real. Elena wasn't acting. She was just being a mother, and in her presence, the heavy shroud of grief that had smothered his home for a year began to thin, allowing small rays of light to pierce through. One evening, after the girls were tucked into bed, Julian found Elena in the living room, standing before the wall of windows, looking down at the city. A single framed photograph sat on a nearby console table, a picture of him and a beautiful, vibrant woman with a dazzling smile. "Sarah." Elena turned as he approached, a sad, empathetic look on her face. She was beautiful, Julian. He expected to feel a surge of defensiveness, a protective anger at the stranger looking at the ghost of his wife. Instead, he just felt tired. The burden of maintaining his stoic facade was exhausting. He walked over and stood beside her, his guard finally, completely, falling away. "She was," he said, his voice thick. "She was everything." He told her about Sarah, how they had met in a college literature class, arguing over the meaning of a poem, how she had challenged him, made him laugh, and opened up a world of art and passion he, the pragmatic business major, had never known. She was the architect of his life, not just his wife. She had designed their first home, picked out Maya's name, and filled every day with a light and energy that he had taken for granted. Then, his voice dropped, the story turning down a dark, rain-slicked road. "The night she died, it was raining, just like the night I met you." He sank onto the sofa, the memory playing out behind his eyes. "We were arguing, something stupid. I had missed another one of her gallery openings because of a meeting that ran late. She said I was becoming a ghost in my own family, that my company was more important than her or Maya. He confessed the detail that had haunted his every waking moment since. I was driving. I was angry, defensive. I looked away from the road for just a second to argue back at her. That's when it happened. A truck hydroplaned. I never even saw it coming. He buried his face in his hands, the polished CEO crumbling into a man consumed by guilt. It was my fault. She was right. I wasn't there for them. And in the 1 second I took my eyes off the road, I lost her forever. Maya was in the back seat. She saw everything. And she's been silent ever since. He had been living with this crushing weight, believing he was responsible not only for his wife's death but for his daughter's silence. His desperation to give Maya a mommy for her birthday wasn't just about making her happy. It was a desperate act of atonement. Elena sat down beside him, not with words of pity or absolution, but with a quiet, profound understanding. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She simply sat with him in his grief. After a long silence, she shared a piece of her own story. Lily's father left the day I told him I was pregnant, she said softly. He said he wasn't ready to be a father. I was alone for the whole pregnancy, for the birth, for every single day since. For a long time I thought I was broken, that I wasn't enough for someone to want to stay. In that shared moment of confession, in that quiet space of acknowledged pain and past failures, the last barrier between them dissolved. They were no longer a desperate father and his hired consultant. They were two broken people who, in trying to heal a child, were beginning to accidentally heal each other. The pretense was melting away, replaced by the warm, fragile, and terrifying beginnings of something real. In the wake of Julian's confession, the atmosphere in the penthouse underwent a profound transformation. The invisible lines of their arrangement blurred and then vanished completely. The carefully constructed pretense gave way to a comfortable, unforced domesticity. It was no longer his home and her temporary residence. It was their shared space, filled with the sounds of two children's laughter and the quiet hum of a family finding its rhythm. Laughter, an emotion that had been absent for so long it felt foreign, became a regular occurrence. Julian discovered that Lily had an infectious giggle and that Elena had a dry, witty sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him smile in a way he hadn't in years. One afternoon, he walked in to find them having a dance party in the living room to a silly children's song. Elena was dancing with goofy abandon, and Lily was twirling until she was dizzy. In the corner, Maya was swaying back and forth, a genuine, wide smile on her face. The sight was so pure, so full of life, that it struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. This was what he had been missing. This was what he had thought was lost forever. He began to leave work earlier, delegating meetings he once would have considered unmissable. The pull of going home, truly home, was stronger than the allure of any business deal. He found himself on his hands and knees, the powerful CEO of Vance Industries, building elaborate pillow forts that spanned the entire living room. He read bedtime stories, his deep voice creating different characters, earning small, silent smiles from Maya and sleepy cuddles from Lily. For Elena, the constant state of high alert she had lived in for years began to recede. The gnawing fear of where the next meal would come from, of whether the lights would stay on, was gone. For the first time since Lily was born, she felt safe. She wasn't just playing a role. She was actively caring for this small, fractured family, and they, in turn, were caring for her. She found herself watching Julian with the girls, admiring the gentle way he spoke to them, the fierce love that was so evident in his eyes. She was falling for him, a terrifying and exhilarating realization. This temporary haven was starting to feel like the only home she had ever known. This peaceful bubble, however, was fragile. One morning, a crisp, official-looking envelope arrived, forwarded from her old, defunct mailing address. Elena's blood ran cold as she saw the return address. A predatory payday loan company she had been forced to use months ago during a particularly desperate time. It was a final demand notice, filled with threatening legal jargon and an exorbitant balance inflated by impossible interest rates. The piece of paper felt like a brand, a stark and shameful reminder of the life she had just escaped. It screamed that she didn't belong here, in this world of effortless wealth and security. She was an imposter, a fraud, and this letter was the proof. She crumpled it in her fist, her eyes burning with tears of humiliation, and hid in the guest bathroom, her carefully constructed composure shattering. Later that day, Julian found her staring out the window, her expression distant and troubled. He had noticed the shift in her mood, the return of a shadow to her eyes that he had been so happy to see disappear. He gently asked what was wrong. When she couldn't bring herself to answer, he revealed that he had found the crumpled letter in the wastebasket. Elena flinched, expecting judgment, disgust. Instead, he simply took her hand. "Elena," he said, his voice low and steady, "the only thing that letter tells me is how hard you fought to survive. It's not a mark of shame. It's a badge of courage." The next day, his lawyer contacted her. The debt had been taken care of. It was settled, paid in full, the account closed forever. Julian never mentioned it again. He didn't use it as leverage or hold it over her. He had simply seen a threat to her peace of mind and eliminated it, quietly and decisively. This silent act of protection was more intimate than any touch, a profound gesture that told her she was no longer alone in her fight. The feeling she had for him deepened, solidifying from a fragile hope into a powerful, undeniable love. The day of Maya's 6th birthday arrived, dawning bright and clear. The penthouse, once so sterile, was now alive with color. Pink and gold balloons bobbed against the high ceilings, and a long table was laden with treats and a magnificent cake that Elena had helped pick out. Maya was a vision in a frilly pink dress Julian had bought for her. Though she was still silent, her eyes sparkled with an excitement that was palpable. She refused to let go of Elena's hand, a small, warm anchor in the swirl of activity. The guests began to arrive, a handful of Julian's business associates with their families, a few parents and children from Maya's small private school. The atmosphere was polite, if a little reserved. Julian was a gracious host, but his eyes constantly sought out Elena, a silent, reassuring connection across the room. Then, the doorman buzzed from downstairs, announcing an unexpected guest. A moment later, the elevator doors opened to reveal a woman who carried with her an immediate chill. She was impeccably dressed in a Chanel suit, her silver hair styled in a severe chignon. Her face was elegant, but her eyes were as cold and hard as chips of ice. Julian's posture stiffened instantly. "Agnes," he said, his voice tight. "Julian," she replied, her voice like cut glass. "You didn't possibly think I would miss my own granddaughter's birthday, did you?" This was Agnes Thorne, Sarah's mother. Agnes's gaze swept the room, her lips thinning in disapproval at the cheerful decorations. Then her eyes landed on Elena, who was standing with Maya by the gift table. She took in Elena's simple but elegant dress, a dress Julian had insisted on buying for her, and her expression curdled with a mixture of suspicion and pure disdain. She glided across the room, a shark moving through placid waters. "And who is this?" she asked, her eyes raking over Elena from head to toe, pointedly ignoring Lily, who was hiding behind Elena's legs. "Agnes, this is Elena," Julian said, stepping quickly to Elena's side. "She's a friend." "A friend," Agnes repeated, the word dripping with insinuation. "I see," she gave Elena a smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. "It's so good of you to help out." Julian must be so lost without Sarah to handle these little domestic affairs. Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to mark Elena as the hired help, an outsider, an unworthy presence in the home her daughter had built. The battle lines were drawn. Agnes, the ghost of Julian's past and the guardian of Sarah's memory, had arrived to shatter their fragile new world. The air in the penthouse grew thick with unspoken tension. Agnes moved through the party like a queen holding court, her presence a constant, chilling reminder of the life that had existed in this space before Elena. She would share a fond, cutting memory of her Sarah, always within earshot of Elena. She would pointedly ask Julian about business, reinforcing their shared world of wealth and status, a world from which Elena was clearly excluded. Elena did her best to ignore the subtle attacks, focusing all her attention on Maya, ensuring the birthday girl was happy and shielded from the undercurrents of hostility. The moment came to light the candles on the cake. Everyone gathered around the table, a sea of expectant faces. Julian lifted Maya into his arms so she could see the 6 tiny flames dancing on the pink frosting. The room filled with the collective, off-key sound of the happy birthday song. Through it all, Maya's eyes were fixed on one person, Elena. She looked from the glowing candles on the cake to the warm, reassuring smile on Elena's face. The song ended, and a hush fell over the room. "Make a wish, sweetheart," Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Maya took a deep breath, her small chest puffing out. But instead of blowing, she turned her head, looked directly at Elena, and opened her mouth. A single, tiny, earth-shattering word emerged, clear as a bell in the silent room. "Mommy!" For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Julian's eyes filled with tears, a look of pure, unadulterated joy transforming his face. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, a sob of happiness catching in her throat. It was a miracle, a true, undeniable miracle. But the beautiful moment was violently shattered. "How dare you!" The shriek came from Agnes, her voice a weapon that sliced through the joyful silence. Her face was a mask of incandescent fury. "How dare you stand there and let my granddaughter call you that? How dare you let this tramp replace my daughter?" With a dramatic flourish, Agnes threw a thin manila file onto the cake table. It landed with a slap, scattering papers across the pristine frosting. "I knew something was wrong from the moment I saw her," she spat, her voice rising with vindictive triumph. "I had you investigated." The papers were a cruel collage of Elena's past life. There were grainy photos of her rundown apartment building, a copy of the final demand notice from the loan company, a printout of her last known minimum wage job. It was a curated story of poverty and desperation, assembled to look as damning as possible. "She's a gold digger, Julian. Can't you see it?" Agnes's voice resonated with absolute conviction. Her words aimed not just at him but at the entire, captivated audience of guests. "She's playing you, sinking her claws into you and your daughter to get your money. Is that it? Are you paying her to be here? Did you buy a replacement for my Sarah?" The accusation, vile and public, hung in the air like poison. The guests began to whisper, their curious glances turning to ones of suspicion and judgment. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She was exposed, humiliated, stripped bare in front of all these strangers. All her insecurities, all her feelings of unworthiness, came rushing back in a tidal wave of shame. She looked at Julian, her heart breaking, fully expecting to see disgust and betrayal in his eyes. This was the end. The beautiful dream was over. Julian stood frozen for a fraction of a second, the shock of the attack giving way to a cold, focused calm. He looked at Agnes's triumphant, hateful face. He looked at the whispering guests. Then he looked at Elena. He saw the devastation in her eyes, the shame she didn't deserve, the strength that was so close to breaking. And in that moment, everything became clear. The past and the future, obligation and love, all crystallized into a single, simple choice. He stepped forward, deliberately placing himself between Elena and Agnes, a human shield against the venom. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried a weight of absolute authority that silenced the entire room. "You are right about one thing, Agnes," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I did pay her." A collective gasp went through the room. Elena's heart plummeted, the confirmation of the transactional nature of their beginning feeling like a physical blow. She had been right. She was just the hired help. But Julian wasn't finished. He turned his body slightly, his gaze shifting to find Elena's. His eyes were filled not with shame, but with a fierce, unwavering adoration. "I offered this woman a fortune to help me," he continued, his voice resonating with deep emotion. I offered her enough money to solve every problem she had in the world. And she refused it. He let that sink in before continuing, his voice growing stronger with every word. She pushed my check back across the table and told me she would not take a single penny. She said she would only do this for my daughter, not for my money. This woman, who had nothing, who was shivering at a bus stop with her child in her arms, showed more character, more integrity, and more grace in that single moment than anyone I have ever met in my entire life. He took a step toward Elena, taking her trembling hand in his. She didn't come here for my money. She came here and she brought light back into this house. She brought kindness and laughter back into these empty rooms. She brought my daughter back to me. Finally, he turned to face his stunned guests, his arm protectively around Elena's shoulders. "This is not an arrangement," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "This is not a temporary solution. Elena is the woman I love. She and Lily are my family now. And if anyone in this room has a problem with that, the door is right there." The finality in his tone was absolute. He then turned his steely gaze back to Agnes, his expression devoid of pity. "And as for you, Agnes," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level, "Sarah is gone. I will always love her, and I will always cherish her memory. But you will not use that memory as a weapon to poison this house and hurt the people I love any longer. You will respect Elena, or you will not be welcome here. The choice is yours." Defeated, her power utterly broken, Agnes stared at him, her face contorted with rage and disbelief. For the first time, she had no words. With a strangled cry of fury, she turned and stormed out of the apartment, the slamming of the elevator doors her final, impotent act of defiance. A tense silence followed, broken only when one of Julian's business partners stepped forward, a wide smile on his face, and raised his glass. "To the happy family," he said warmly. The crisis was over. The lie had been destroyed, replaced by a brave and beautiful truth. 1 year later, the scene was not a sterile penthouse overlooking the city, but the lush, green backyard of a sprawling home in the suburbs. The air was filled with the scent of cut grass and barbecue, and most importantly, with the sound of unrestrained, joyous laughter. It was Maya's 7th birthday. Maya, no longer a silent, solemn child, was a whirlwind of energy and chatter. She and Lily, now inseparable sisters, squealed with delight as they ran through a rainbow-arced sprinkler, their bright swimsuits a blur of color against the green lawn. "Daddy, watch this!" Maya yelled, executing a clumsy but enthusiastic cartwheel on the wet grass. Julian, standing at the grill, laughed and applauded. Elena watched them from a comfortable lounge chair in the shade, a contented smile on her face. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her pregnant belly. The past year had been a whirlwind of healing and building. They had left the penthouse, a place haunted by too many ghosts, and found a real home, a place where they could plant roots and grow. They were no longer fractured pieces. They were a whole, solid family unit. Julian walked over, wiping his hands on a towel, and knelt beside her chair. He leaned in and kissed her softly, then placed his hand over hers on her belly. "Look at what you did," he whispered, his eyes shining as he watched the girls play. "You brought all this back. You brought us back to life." "We did it together," she corrected him gently. He shook his head. "It all started with you. With your kindness," he grew serious, his gaze turning intense. "Elena, you came into my life for a week, but you saved me for a lifetime. I thought that what we had was a temporary arrangement, but from the moment I met you, I think my soul knew that you were my forever." With a gentle movement, he slid off the chair and onto one knee on the soft grass. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple, elegant diamond ring that sparkled in the afternoon sun. "Elena," he said, his voice thick with a love so deep it was tangible. "Will you marry me? Will you do me the honor of making this our official, legal, until the end of time forever?" Tears of pure joy streamed down Elena's face as she nodded, unable to speak. "Yes," she finally breathed. Of course, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger as the girls, sensing the momentous occasion, came running over, dripping and laughing. Are you crying, Mommy? Lily asked, concerned. They're happy tears, sweetie, Elena said, pulling both girls into a tight hug with Julian's arms wrapped around all of them. They were a circle of love, complete and unbreakable. They had learned that a family wasn't something you were born into, but something you built, moment by moment, with kindness, courage, and a love strong enough to heal any wound. If this heartwarming tale stirred your soul, please like, share, and subscribe for more soul-stirring stories about the power of love and second chances. What did you think of Julian's bold declaration? Let us know in the comments below.